Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm going to do a brief reading, and then Jen and I are going to be in conversation, and then we will open up the floor to Q&A if anyone has any questions. But before I begin, I just wanted to thank the Holocaust Museum LA so much for inviting me to speak here. And also to Jen for being willing to be in conversation with me. She works, as Michael mentioned, at Densho, which is this fantastic organization for Japanese American history, and I could never have written this book without Densho's resources. They're all online, and they're all just open. They're not. There's no paywall, and it was immensely helpful for me as a researcher, especially during COVID. And I also just want to say another quick thanks to Barnes & Noble for hosting the event. And as Michael mentioned, my first book, they named a great new writers selection, and I don't think I would have been able to get a second book contract if it hadn't been for that support. So I want to thank Barnes & Nobles for that support as well. So, okay. Chapter 1, Forced. March 30th, 1942. Just past dawn, Elaine Buchman Yoneda stood on a Los Angeles sidewalk, unsure where to turn. She looked up at the building before her, solid concrete and stretching half a block, the South Spring Street Civil Control Station, where she'd been ordered to bring her 3-year-old son, Tommy, for deportation to a concentration camp. In the early morning light, a cool wind strafed her cheek and rustled her brown curls. She hesitated for a moment, then straightened in resolve. Reaching just under 5 feet, Elaine was still known to stand tall in the face of adversity, rising as if she could launch past such minor constraints as biology, as if she'd tower over anything in her way. She paid no heed to nature's limits. Elaine would stare down anyone who tried to take her son. Keeping Tommy by her side, she surveyed the crowd of people already waiting, one long line snaking down South Spring Street. Overhead, trolley cables hung in the air, taut black wires against a pale sky. The streetcars would be getting even more use soon, as rubber rations made new tires scarce. Essentials would continue to dwindle now that Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor and the country was at war. Many in line that morning wore their Sunday best, despite the new deprivations of wartime. They may have been Japanese, but almost all were American too. Some were likely US veterans, Elaine knew, having served their country faithfully. Not even that would matter now. Before answering the order to appear that morning, men had donned ties and bowler hats, women pressed dresses and starched collars. Girls had forced their straight black hair into neat waves. Most stood quietly as they peered through the early light, some with heads craned forward as if they might catch a glimpse of their fate. Elaine was the only white person among them. Looking down, she watched the breeze disturb Tommy's dark ringlets, their hue from her husband, their texture from her. The child breathed in and out, cold air filling his torso, each breath like a gift from the grip of his asthmatic chest. Elaine had spent much of his short life in and out of hospitals with him. Too much dust, too strenuous an exertion could leave him gasping, liable to drown in the liquid of his lungs. But Elaine refused to give in to fear. She would do whatever necessary to protect him. For it was him the army wanted, she'd been told over the phone by a priest the night before. Not you, the priest had explained. Not if you're white, he meant, even though she'd given birth to a half-Japanese child. The clergyman was from the Maryknoll Mission, a Roman Catholic order that had long worked with the Japanese American community, and was now assisting with their removal on the West Coast. Foreign or citizen, healthy or sick, loyal or lost, all had to go. But as for Elaine, "Oh, you don't have to go. You don't have to go," he'd said the previous evening as she'd clutched the handset in her parents' apartment, the darkness shrouding their home in the Jewish enclave of Boyle Heights. "Nor will you be allowed to," he'd suggested. Elaine had stared, stupefied, into the air. She was trying, with little success, to absorb this frocked man's nonsense. That day, March 29th, 1942, Civil Exclusion Order No. 3 had been issued. 2,000 people of Japanese descent living around Elaine were to appear for processing by 8 o'clock the next morning at 707 South Spring Street Civil Control Station in preparation for transport 220 miles inland to a dusty plain called Manzanar at the foot of the Sierra Nevada. In no more than 3 days, by April 2nd at noon sharp, not a soul among them should be left. Elaine had heard the announcement herself over the radio that evening. It had been addressed to, quote, all persons of Japanese ancestry, both aliens and non-aliens. It conveyed an order directly from the Western Defense Command and Fourth Army of the United States, with a time and place for those in the vicinity of Los Angeles to report the next day for, quote, registration. According to the U.S. Army, her son Tommy, like anyone along the West Coast with even the slightest amount of Japanese blood, was to be rounded up, evacuated, they called it, and sent to a camp. Hearing the announcement, Elaine had been frantic. Surely they wouldn't try to take a 3-year-old half-Japanese child. She'd called the nearest army station. She'd called the Maryknoll Mission. The only answer she could get was that she needed to appear the next morning with Tommy, or she'd be in violation of the Army's order. According to federal law, she'd be subject to a fine of $5,000, imprisonment, or both. Now on the sidewalk, with a rising sun throwing shadows across the pavement, Elaine saw a soldier and a priest run towards her. "Not here, not here," she heard one of them shouting. The men surrounded Elaine and Tommy, then hurried them towards the building, what had formerly been named the Security First National Bank. Etched columns still flanked the entrance, fluted pillars 3 stories high, stretching towards the cold expanse of sky. Elaine knew immediately why these men had balked at her presence in a line not meant for whites. Their haste failed to surprise. She had spent years leading labor demonstrations, protesting California's racist and repressive policies, being menaced by Red Squad batons. She'd even been jailed, bruised by brass knuckles. She defied the state's anti-miscegenation laws by marrying a Japanese-American man, a fellow activist, so she would not be cowed by this priest or soldier before her now. The men ushered Elaine and Tommy inside, the priest again insisting that it was her son they wanted, not her. As if they were just going to roll out the red carpet for her and then expect her to hand over her son, she thought. If these men thought she was just going to surrender her child, well, then they really knew from nothing. I'm skipping ahead a little, just to the last part that I'm going to read. Elaine's parents, like Karl's, had immigrated to the United States around the turn of the century. Karl is her husband. I don't know if I said his name in the previous part. The Buchmans had fled the bloody pogroms of Eastern Europe, where reports of mass murder of Jews were beginning to emerge in March 1942. Yet in Los Angeles, the Buchmans assumed they were safe because they were American citizens, and they were white. Of course, Karl was a citizen too, born right here in California. But Karl had gone to Japan as a child when his father fell ill and his parents decided to return to their native village in Hiroshima. Then, as a young man, Karl fled back to California to escape conscription in the Emperor's army. Like the U.S. military in 1942, when the Japanese army had looked at Karl in 1926, they saw not an American, but an ethnic destiny. Karl detested Japan's steely imperialism, their thirst to colonize Asia themselves, rather than leave it to Western conquerors. He disdained their threats against his widowed mother, who'd stayed in Hiroshima after he deserted. Karl and Elaine had together watched in horror as Japan's theory of expansion, its so-called Pan-Asianism, had metastasized throughout the 1930s, from slogans to a militarized Manchurian puppet state to bayonets piercing the flesh of Nanking's Chinese citizens. Despite the obvious indignity of America's West Coast so-called evacuation, Karl planned to enlist in the U.S. military and fight the Axis as soon as the Allies would take him. He'd do whatever it took to defeat fascism. For who knew what the Japanese would do to a so-called deserter if they captured U.S. soil? But more than that, Karl needed to protect his family. After all, his beloved Elaine was Jewish, and their son was a Japanese-American Jew. Karl had tried to enlist before he'd left for Manzanar, but the Army recruitment officer had turned him away. Like all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, even war veterans, he had overnight been designated ineligible to serve, considered an enemy alien by his own country. These were among the many heavy disappointments Karl had carried with him on the long and lonely trip to Manzanar a week earlier, when he departed, along with 1,000 other able-bodied men of Japanese descent, on a cold, gray Los Angeles morning, the chill tempting some to turn up their collars. Karl had been comforted, though, by the thought that at least Elaine, Tommy, and Joyce, who is Elaine's white daughter from her previous marriage, that at least Elaine, Tommy, and Joyce would be safe in L.A. with the Buchmans, Elaine's parents. He remembered the promise he'd been given, along with all the other husbands who had agreed to be among the first at Manzanar, that their families would be the last to be taken, if in his case at all. After all, he assured himself again, who would lock up a 3-year-old? When they finally arrived at the camp, well past sunset, he found little else to lift his mood. He was led by flashlight towards a large unfinished shed, past wooden skeletons of barracks that he and the others had come to Manzanar to build. The shelter for the early arrivals like Karl stood empty, without toilets, water, or even window panes. The men were given straw to stuff into sacks for mattresses. Just before midnight, lying in the inky darkness, a bunkmate he'd known from Los Angeles called out to him. "Hey, Karl, we weren't supposed to end up in a place like this." Karl made no attempt to answer. Then, exhausted, he slept. Rising early the next morning in a freeze so deep that the water refused to run, Karl and the others found a single spigot rising from the dirt outside the barrack. Ice cold and bone dry. Then he got his first full glimpse of camp. A barren, dusty landscape, stacks of construction material, the hospital complex being built upon a hill, barbed wire lacing the front and sides, and soldiers with bayonets and submarine guns guarding the perimeter. In the distance stood the vast, snow-capped spread of the Sierras, their beauty so stark against the desert plain, it took Karl's breath. He ached for Elaine and Tommy, not knowing how or when he'd see them again, or if. But within 3 days, he'd seen enough of the environment with its howling sandstorms that stopped the men from working and coated every crevice thick with dust. He knew that even if visits would be permitted, his wife should not bring their son anywhere near Manzanar. The food alone was a threat, sending the men running repeatedly for the portable toilets. He wrote to Elaine, warning her against visiting even if the opportunity arose. She and Tommy should stay away, he said, at least until Karl and the other early arrivals could improve conditions enough to maybe tamp down the dust, perhaps by planting grass around the barracks or a vegetable garden. With Tommy's allergies and asthma, the camp could kill him.
Tracy, can you all hear me? Tracy, thank you so much for that reading. I mean, I've read the whole book, so I don't want to spoil anything, but I really highly recommend that, you know, if that reading gave you a little glimpse into truly the really crazy and difficult situation and decision that the Yoneda family needed to make, I think, you know, if that interested you, you'll want to read the rest of that. So, yeah, and so I'm again Jen Noji. I'm here on behalf of Densho, an organization dedicated to preserving and sharing the history of Japanese American incarceration. But I just feel so lucky to be here today. So thank you so much to the Holocaust Museum LA, Barnes & Noble, and then again Tracy for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Because, you know, one thing at Densho that we really, really appreciate is engaging with the history of the incarceration in new and, you know, really very glossed over, you know, so in new ways, illuminating histories that are super glossed over, stories that are really not told. So thank you so much for calling attention to the Yoneda family's experiences. So to give you a little bit more context or information about me, so I'm actually half Japanese American, half German, which maybe I could talk about a little bit later. But, you know, my Japanese American half really influenced a lot of what I would go on to do in my personal and professional life. And so my, to say a little bit more, I can maybe save some information and details for later, but my Japanese American grandparents then, like the family in this story and like, you know, over 125,000 other people of Japanese descent were incarcerated during World War II. And so my grandmother's family had been in California and my grandfather's family had been in Oregon. But with, you know, the order to remove, again, all people of Japanese ancestry, they were forcefully removed and displaced and ended up in 3 different camps. And, you know, their experiences were in some ways similar to the experiences depicted in this book, but then in other ways very, very different. And I think what Tracy does so nicely and so well in this book is call attention to the fact that there is such a diversity of experiences of those who had been incarcerated in these U.S. Concentration camps. And yeah, maybe I can say a little bit more later about how my family's experiences differed and compared once we delve into the conversation a little bit more. But for now, I'll just say it was truly a pleasure to learn so much more about my own family's history through reading this book. So thank you. And with that, I think, you know, we just wanted to dive in. I want to pose some questions to Tracy. And then please keep in mind, we will have an open Q&A session later. So if any questions come up for you, please jot them down or just make a mental note, and then we'll ask you for your questions later. But to begin, my first question was actually, you know, about the language that you use in this book. And in particular, you know, you use the word concentration camp. And, you know, I was wondering what kind of pushback, if any, have you received for using that term? And why do you use it?
Yeah, so that's a common question that I get. So thank you for bringing the issue into the space. So let me take the second part of the question first, which is why I use the term. And related to that, why I do not use the term internment, although that's a really commonly used term today. The reason I do not use the term internment is because the actual definition of internment is the detainment of foreigners. And as you know, Jen gestured towards, 2/3 of the people who were incarcerated in these camps, in these U.S. camps, were U.S. citizens. They were born in the U.S. They had never been a foreigner a day in their life. And the the kind of lie upon which the forced removal and incarceration was built was that despite their citizenship, because of their Japanese blood, they were forever foreign. And so I don't want to use the word internment, even though I know a lot of people use it, and they use it not meaning to suggest anything negative or to minimize the history. But I don't use it for that reason, and I am opposed to using it myself because I think it does prolong the the myth upon which the camps were built. The other reason I use concentration camp is because if you look at the dictionary definition of the concentration camps, which I had to write it down because I didn't want to trust myself. Now I need my glasses. Sorry, hold on one second. If you look at the dictionary definition of concentration camp, this is from Merriam-Webster. It's, quote, a place where large numbers of people, such as prisoners of war, political prisoners, refugees, or members of an ethnic or religious minority, are detained or confined under armed guard without due process. And that's exactly what these camps were. And they were also referred to commonly at the time as concentration camps. Just one example of that is when the forced removal and incarceration was still being discussed, and the question of whether or not U.S. citizens should be included in the forced removal, or whether it should only be immigrants, which is what the case was for the Italian American and German American communities. The German American and Italian American citizens were not incarcerated. So when this discussion was going on in Congress, California Representative Leland Ford said on the House floor, and I quote, "Any patriotic native-born Japanese," by which he meant Japanese American citizen, but apparently couldn't bring himself to say that, "should submit himself to a concentration camp and should not object to that small sacrifice." So, and it was commonly used in the media as well. So this is what the camps were called at the time by many people. And I'll just add one other quick thing to that, and that is that while I was writing the book, I went back and looked at a lot of newspaper archives leading up to the incarceration and forced removal. And I saw evidence of the fact that, the Nazis themselves were actually, I refer to the Nazi camps as extermination and slave labor camps, because in essence that's what they were. But they used the term special concentration camp to kind of obscure the truth of what they were doing. So I could trace through the Yonedas themselves this deep discomfort with the term concentration camp as the news of the Nazi atrocities was leaking out. And then I think once the news of the Nazi extermination camps really broke, which the full extent of it wasn't until after the war, which I know because you've studied a lot of this. Concentration camp became the term that was used for the Nazi camps, but I think that's really unfortunate in many different ways, and one of the ways is that I think it obscures the history of the Japanese American camps, and that it's so important to remember 80 to 90,000 of the people who were incarcerated in these camps were fellow U.S. citizens. So that's why. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining that. And I guess the second question I had then was, why did you decide to tell this story, right? The story of the only Japanese Jewish family, at least on record, that was incarcerated during World War II in one of these camps.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just highlight what you said on record, because I want to make it clear that I can't prove that they were the only Jewish Japanese family. I don't know that they weren't. I've gone through the government records that were kept of the camps, which are notoriously kind of spotty. And Elaine is the only Jewish woman who is identified as being an incarcerated at the camp. But I don't know for sure that there were no others. They were the only ones who showed up in the records, and so that's why I say on record. So I chose to tell their story for a number of reasons. One, because my family, I'm in a mixed Jewish-Japanese marriage, but my husband's Japanese, not Japanese American. So when I was pregnant with my kiddo, I realized this is going to be the first Japanese American in our family, and also the first Jewish Japanese American. So I was really interested in the intersection of these two histories. So that's what originally started my interest in it. But the reason I think that their story is so important is kind of multifold. One reason doesn't actually have to do with their particular ethnic mix, but just the fact that they were a mixed family. Because I learned that there were over 2,000 approximately people in mixed race families who were incarcerated at one point or another in these American concentration camps. And that's a story I had never heard about. I've never seen it written about in narrative history. It has been written about in scholarship a little bit, but there's never been something written about it that I found for kind of a general educated audience. So I felt was a the experience of these families and the separation that they experienced. If you read the book, you'll learn that Elaine had to choose whether or not to go into Manzanar, and part of that choice was that she would have to leave Joyce behind, her daughter from her first marriage. So she would have to choose to go into Manzanar with Tommy or let them take Tommy without her. But if she chose to go into Manzanar with Tommy, she'd have to leave Joyce behind. So anyway, that was very moving and evocative, I thought, and I realized there must have been thousands of people in mixed families who faced this situation. And then the more I read about it, the more I realized that the policies, and there were policies in the camps for how to deal with, how to identify and define and then police and then deal with the mixed race families in the camps. And I realized when you look at these policies, it really shows in a kind of a paradoxical but incredibly clear way the deep racial obsession that underlay the entire forced removal and incarceration. And there still are some people, I think, who believe the lie that it was military necessity, that there was some military reason why this enormous population, this enormously sized community was incarcerated. And this just shows how obsessed the government was. If you look at the language, and I talk about it some in the book, and if anyone actually wants to see the documents, you're welcome to get in touch with me. They're on Densho's site. I can send you the link. But it is really chilling the way, there's this obsession with identifying the percentage of Japanese blood, and then with identifying, the different treatment of if a non-Japanese woman was married to a Japanese American man, you were treated differently than if it was the reverse. There was always this weird obsession with gender too, and the culture of the family being defined by the husband. So that was also, I thought, really important. And then the other reason went back to something that you said earlier, which is about the heterogeneity of the camp population. And I thought this story of the Yonedas, both because they were mixed, of mixed heritage, and because Elaine and Karl were both very prominent leftist activists, as I kind of alluded to a little bit in the part that I read. And the story of there was some real ideological rifts in the camp. In not just Manzanar, in all the camps, actually. Actually, I don't know about in all the camps. I'm assuming in all the camps, but in more camps than Manzanar I read about. There were some real ideological rifts and really deep and at times violent disagreements over how to address the issue of the incarceration in light of, the Allies fighting this supposed, the fascist forces, but here you're struggling against this from inside an American concentration camp. And the leftist community had a very different reaction and decision making, came up with very different decisions about how to address that than many of the other incarcerees did. And so through the Yoneda's story, you can see there are so many different ways in which their story opens up a kind of window into the incredible heterogeneity of the incarcerated population, and that itself goes back, I think, in another way to the initial lie about that undergirded the forced removal and incarceration, which was that this was a population of people who were all the same, that because of their Japanese blood, they were all just dangerous. They were nothing else but dangerous. Infants, orphans, elderly people, men of supposed military age, whatever, no matter what you were dangerous. So I think it's important to remember the real human diversity within the camp.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll just say quickly that Tracy really did a fantastic job of just making clear these super arbitrary but very complex and pretty disturbing ways that the U.S. government, decided to just incarcerate this entire population, like you said, based on blood. I mean, really, as you point out in the book, incarcerating orphans who didn't even know they were of Japanese descent, right? So very extreme, and I'll just say that I was really, really just happy that you did shed light on these really, complex policies that were used to justify, such immense violence. But also, you did it in a way that was, it did not at all take away from the story itself. And so, I was very, very impressed to see how you somehow managed to make history, the facts, and even quoting specific lines from the policies, so enjoyable to read.
Oh, thank you.
And yeah, really, really just weaving in all of this really enlightening historical information into the narrative. So well done.
Thanks, Jen.
So you already alluded to this. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, what made the Yonedas experience unique, and if there's anything you wanted to add on, and then also if you wanted to say more about, in which ways weren't their experiences unique.
Okay. Yeah. So in some ways, I guess I've alluded to some of the ways that they were unique. I will add that they were more unique among the population across all the camps for their leftist stance than they were for their mixed heritage, the mixed heritages in their family. And there were not, comparatively, there was not a huge ratio of incarcerees who were mixed race or in mixed race families, but there was an even smaller ratio of people who were leftists. So in that way, they were, their story is pretty unique. Also, I think Tommy's experiences, the way the documentation that we have about Tommy's experiences in Manzanar are in some ways unique and in some ways not unique. He suffered very deeply from the environmental hazards of Manzanar. He was not the only one. I came across documentation, a pretty disturbing documentation of how other people suffered and developed conditions from which they eventually died, that they had never had before, and was no really other rational way to explain it other than that they had lived in this very sort of brutal environment of Manzanar. And also the food was really problematic for a lot of the incarcerees, but particularly for Tommy because he had so many allergies. So he suffered more intensely than a lot of incarcerees, but because of the environmental conditions, but not uniquely at all. And there were certainly other people, I would imagine, who suffered as much as he did. And then the last way in which I think they were unique was because of their leftist politics, the decision that they made, and that was very vehemently embraced by the leftist community outside the camp. And that one gets the sense they sort of had to embrace were they to keep their connection to the leftist community outside of camp, which of course was deeply important to them, was that the fight against the Nazi forces and the Japanese imperial forces, but even more focused on the Nazi forces, that had to take precedence. And that whatever crime was being committed by the U.S. government by incarcerating the West Coast Japanese American community, that was an issue that needed to be dealt with after the war, when and if the Allies won the war. And actually in 1942, when they were in Manzanar, it wasn't actually clear at all. In fact, it looked like the Axis was going to win actually in that part of time when they were in Manzanar. So anyway, and they were involved in, they were targeted in the pressures in the camp in Manzanar and in some of the other camps as well, which don't have expertise in, but I do know that some of this happened in other camps as well. But in Manzanar became quite violent with the pressures about different ways to respond to the incarceration. And Karl's name was put on a death list. Then Tommy was also Elaine was told that Tommy was also targeted to be killed. So by there was a uprising. There was this is the climax of the book, so I won't say too much. But there was what the Yonedas call the riot, and historians today generally term the Manzanar uprising, which is the term that I use. So there was an uprising that was mostly against the administration, but partly there were people who were targeted as being too collaborationists. And so in any case, Tommy, I think, was quite traumatized by having witnessed that. So in that way, he was also unique, though he was not the only person who, but I think he was the only, his age made him unique in having gone through that. So.
Yeah, definitely was very shocking for me to read how, in this period with increased tension among the Japanese American community, that a 3.5-year-old boy could be targeted, or maybe he was 4 at that time. But yeah, so thank you so much for sharing that. I wanted to just move on to a slightly different question about your research. So you did so much extensive research in putting together this book, as seen by the however many 30 to 50 pages at the end where you just have notes.
I wanted more, and the press was like, nope, it's already enough.
But I mean, that was really super helpful for anyone who is curious to learn more about the history. And I was wondering, while you were doing this research, was there anything that you found most surprising, interesting, or, shocking, anything noteworthy that you found in putting together this book, about the incarceration and forced removal experience in general?
Yeah. So I guess the two things that I found the most shocking, can I do two? Okay. I'll do them quickly, though. So, because then I have a question I want to ask you. The two things that I found most shocking was one, and I referenced this earlier, just the intense racial obsession that underlay the what was called the mixed marriage or mixed blood policy in the camp. It was It was referred to either way by administrators in the camps, it was, like you said, it was shocking. It was also so absurd. There's this one document that I referenced where, for family members, mothers or wives who had no known Japanese descent, this did not happen with Elaine, because Elaine was the first white woman. There was one other white woman on her transport to Manzanar, but she was the Yonedas were the first mixed family, basically, that was in Manzanar, that you can see that the records indicate. And Manzanar was the first camp, actually, that opened. So, but after Elaine, they, in the months that it took to lock up the 120,000 people, they came up with a form for someone who had no known Japanese descent, who did not want to relinquish their children or their spouse to a concentration camp without them. And they had to sign a document that said that they agreed to become as if Japanese, conform in all respects as if they were a person of Japanese ancestry. So to follow all the rules, to not be able to leave, and to sign this without duress, of course. So, the government's trying to posit this as a choice. And Elaine actually felt in many ways that she had made a choice. And I can't argue with her about her I mean, first of all, I can't argue with her, she's not here, but I would never try to argue with someone about their feelings and their experience. But I think it's important to remember that for any of these people who signed this document, it was not a real choice. Like, if someone tried to take my child, it wouldn't be a choice for me. My child's actually back there smiling. So that was one. And then the other quick thing that I'll just mention it quickly, and we haven't discussed it at all, but it is part of the book, and so I'll just throw it out there. And then if you're more interested, you could either read the book or get in touch with me about it. But so the person who, you probably already knew this, but the person who was most responsible for planning and then executing the entire forced removal and incarceration was this Jewish American man who was a colonel in the. Well, he was named a colonel because of his quick skill in doing this. His name was Karl, and he was Benditson, yeah. And he was Jewish American. His family came from the Pale of Settlement, same area where Elaine's family came from, same area where my family came from. And he was Jewish, but he hid the fact that he was Jewish. He changed his name, and and then he rewrote his biography, his official biography, so that he had Nordic ancestors, which he didn't. He wasn't mixed. He was just so. Anyway, that to me was so fascinating. The way in which he was unable. He first of all, that he saw ethnicity in some ways as something that you could just put on paper. And second of all, that he was unable to see people as complex at all, that they were kind of defined by their ethnicity. And if he was going to be the person that he wanted to be, then he couldn't be Jewish. I mean, he actually probably could not have been so successful in the military had he been Jewish, because that was another thing I learned. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in the U.S. military at that time too. But in any case, so those were the two things. I'll stop there. So those are the two things. But can I ask you a question? Okay. So I just really wanted to know, what was it like for you as someone who had family who was incarcerated in one of these camps, to read about the Yonedas and to read about their decision that they were not going, not only were they not that in order to support the United States and the Allied war effort, they could not protest the camps or even call attention to how bad the camps were while they were inside of them, inside the camps. I really wonder, what was it like for you to read about that, because it's hard even for someone who didn't have family in the camps.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I have many thoughts. I think one thing I should mention is that growing up, my grandparents hardly ever talked about their incarceration experience. And so they had been incarcerated from, well, my grandmother was a little bit younger, but in their teenage years. So clearly they remember it. It shaped their lives greatly. But I really learned so much about, my own family history through personal research or through organizations like Densho, actually, which gets together oral histories and, government records, etc. So I'll just start by saying that, because every time I read anything, I'm always feeling like it's just me learning more about this history that is so closely related to my own family history. But in terms of the Yoneda's decision to not protest the government's actions because they wanted to prioritize fighting, these what they called the fascist powers, so Germany and Imperial Japan. I mean, I think it's very understandable. They were afraid. They were afraid of what could happen if the U.S. didn't win the war. And I think for us, it's easy to have this framework where we know the U.S. we know that Germany was defeated, Japan was defeated. But at the time, as you alluded to, Tracy, they weren't sure. And they were actually truly afraid of, okay, well, if, and you write this in the book, but if Japan wins, what will happen? Everything that we're experiencing here will be so much worse. And so in their minds, it sounded like, let's defeat the worser of two evils right now. And then later, hopefully after the U.S. wins, then the U.S. is one of the countries, but after we win, then we'll address the injustice that has happened in our community. And I think it is really understandable. And yet I also think about us, in our contemporary moment, or even anyone throughout history. I think it's unfortunate that, when you are in a position of powerlessness, it's hard to protest. And it was very interesting, because I couldn't help but feel like, Karl and Elaine Yoneda really had this sort of zero-sum mindset where, if I protest the injustice in the U.S., it will take away from the fact that there's even what they saw is even worse injustice going on in other countries. And so they wanted to fight one battle at a time, which I think is very understandable, but also, you know, maybe it could have been more eye-opening for the government, or maybe the things could have been learned by actually comparing and drawing attention to the fact, you know, there's horrible atrocity abroad, but there's also serious injustice and violence going on here. And even just showing, you know, parallels or how things are happening at the same time, it could have been very eye-opening. And, you know, would it have stopped the U.S. government? Probably not. But maybe it would have, you know, led to the Yonedas not being so targeted in camp, seen as informers or sort of too loyal to the U.S. So really good question, just a very difficult one.
Yeah, it is a really difficult one. And the people in the camps, actually I write a bit about, who did protest and who were, you know, some of whom targeted the Yonedas, but some of whom just felt deeply betrayed by their country and just wanted to protest against what was happening. You know, I learned about that movement too, and how many of the people who espoused that view said, this is what it means to be a true American, to stand up and say you cannot take away citizens' constitutional rights. And that's so true. So it was weird for me writing it that I totally had compassion, and I totally thought both sides were right. And that's like, but then I realized, like, that's kind of like what life is, right? That both sides are right and there's never a good, and like, well, not there's never a good answer, but so many times there's no good answer. And what do we do about that? And I guess that's why I kind of felt like the Yoneda's story sort of offered some solace in a way to me, to just see someone else going through an experience where there actually are no right answers or no perfect answers. And how do you deal with the total trauma of that, really? So.
Yeah, and if I could add on, I think, you know, so as a reader, also as a descendant, I definitely found myself thinking that my understanding of resistance and, you know, justice is different. It's expanded, because what I learned and what I have been learning through all of my research is that, you know, so many of these people are simply doing what they think is right and what they think is most just. But of course, that looks so different for different people, and and I, you know, I don't want to spoil anything, but I did really love that while focusing on the Yoneda's experiences, you did call attention to the experiences of others, including somebody who was kind of the opposite political ideology and opinion, very, you could say, more so pro Japan, just feeling so betrayed by the U.S., even though he had been a World War I veteran.
Yeah, you're talking about Joseph Kurihara.
Yes.
Yeah, he's another figure in the book, not a character, a historical figure.
Yeah, and so you didn't paint anyone as good or bad, but really just showing how they made their decisions, truly believing that they were fighting for justice and trying to help their community, but they took such different routes.
Yeah. And you can't help but have respect, I think, for that, no matter kind of where it ends up. But, well, I shouldn't say no matter where it ends up, but I can't help but have respect for people trying to make the right decision under terrible circumstances, even if they end up making a decision that may not have been the one that I made. So, Jen, you've mentioned to me that you yourself are mixed with a German mother and a Japanese American father, and I wondered, like, you've kind of alluded to this a little bit, but as a mixed race person yourself, were there parts of the story, sorry, I can't see anything without my glasses, were there any parts of the story that resonated with you in particular? Like, not just that you learned, but that resonated with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't sound that personal in some ways, but I really, you know, just appreciated how the story was, you know, highlighting Japanese American incarceration history, but at the same time, you know, throughout the book, you bring in events and moments from Europe, right? So from the Nazi atrocities, the Holocaust. And so as somebody who did inherit this legacy of the German violence and perpetrator on my German side, but then also to have inherited the family legacy from the Japanese American incarceration side. It was so interesting to see these histories be brought in conversation, and at least to see how they're unfolding at the same time, and actually seeing how people in these US camps are thinking about what's happening abroad and how that's actually affecting their decisions. So it's like not quite like a very personal take, but just as somebody who's constantly thinking about two sides of World War II, two of the many sides of World War II, that was really interesting. And then also I think just really empathizing with some of the decisions, especially around things like family separation, just having to choose between, for example, Elaine, I didn't have this experience in my family because, I'm mixed. So my parents, of course, they had me much later after the war. So it's not like we had mixed race family members during the war. But I just felt myself very empathetic toward their decision to, face some minor prejudice or just feelings of non-belonging within the community because Elaine was white, right? And so she had names called, people had called her names. And then also later, just hearing a little bit more about Tommy's experiences. And actually, I think what did really resonate was, despite the challenges of having their mixed race family, Tommy later is interviewed and he says something about, being really proud of his multicultural heritage and trying to appreciate both sides and practice both sides. And I think that really resonated with me.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Did Elaine have any opportunity to express her Jewishness during her incarceration? Was that welcomed, or was that something she needed to suppress?
So, yes, I'll repeat it. So the question was, did Elaine have any opportunity to practice her Judaism in Manzanar? Is that what you mean? Was that allowed, and was there an opportunity to do that? So, actually, Elaine identified very strongly with her Jewish heritage. She did not have an interest in practicing any organized religion. So there was a clear documentation about that she did not really resonate with organized religion and with practicing Jewish tradition on a religious level. She certainly left documentation of being very proud of her Jewish heritage, and also that she was actually they went back to Russia, and she was there during a pogrom. She didn't really know what was happening, it really taught her, like, she really believed, like, you don't start a fight, but you never ever run from one. And that, for her, I think, was very tied to her Jewish identity. But I don't actually know whether she would have been allowed to practice her Judaism had she wanted to in Manzanar. My sense was, well, I think at first you were not allowed to practice Shinto or Buddhism in any of the camps. Is that right? Okay. So I think that might have been actually more of an issue for the administration. But I can't answer that actually accurately, because she never tried, but I'd have to guess that she either never tried or never left documentation about trying, but my guess is she probably never actually tried to practice.
Are any of her family alive that you've spoken with? And the second question is, I should know this in history, but either I don't or I don't remember it. Were there roundups or incarcerations in any other parts of the U.S. besides Arizona, like in the East Coast and Midwest, anywhere there?
Yes. Okay. So the first question, I'm going to answer the first question, then I'll try to answer the second question. But I'm going to. So Jen's like a real scholar of the whole forced removal and incarceration. So I'm going to ask you to fact check me and add some, because my expertise is just the Yonedas and Manzanar in the 9 months that they were in Manzanar in 1942. So the first question was. Oh, now I forgot the first question. Oh. Does Elaine have any? Did Elaine have any family? Yes. So I interviewed and actually met in person Elaine and Karl's granddaughter, and she was amazing. She basically she gave me information that was not in their archives. Both Elaine and Karl have archives at different libraries in California because they were labor activists, right? So they were actually in the media a lot before the war, and so she gave me information. I did a couple of interviews with her. I learned a lot about the Yonedas after camp and the really severe mental health struggles that Tommy had, and that also Joyce had. From her, and she said to me, there were a couple of things that she told me about their history after camp. I said to her afterwards, I said, her name's Yvonne. I said, Yvonne, is there anything that you've told me that you don't want me to put in the book? Because I probably shouldn't be saying this as an historian, but my feeling was like you're being okay, like your privacy is more important than a book, really. And so she said to me, no, she said you tell the truth and the whole truth, as whatever you can find. But she also said she never once said to me, I need to see that manuscript before. So she was totally generous and totally hands off in the best of ways. So that was that. And then the other question was, were there other roundups? So there were, as I understand it, there were roundups of Japanese immigrants in other parts of the country, and the entire West Coast, not just Arizona, but the entire Japanese American West Coast, which including citizens, was removed. So there were there were roundups of people who were Japanese immigrants, but I just want to point out that there were also roundups of Italian immigrants and German immigrants, but Japanese immigrants were never given the chance to become citizens. So even to me, it doesn't actually even seem totally the same, because they were not allowed to become citizens, whereas a German immigrant or an Italian immigrant could have become a citizen. So, but okay, so let me pass it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add on is, so there was an exclusion zone, and so it included, Washington, Oregon, California, parts of Arizona, but the camps themselves, there were actually many, many camps, if you include these things called assembly centers, these temporary relocation camps. But in terms of the, what we've been calling the US concentration camps, those were War Relocation Authority camps, and there were 10 of those, and those were kind of scattered throughout, starting in California, but then also going, inland toward Arkansas. There was one in Colorado, Arizona, so really pretty spread out. And so it was really, really fascinating to sort of trace the paths that some families took, because sometimes they were moved from one camp to another. So none on the East Coast. And I should say that, right before the forced removal, there was actually this tiny period of time where Japanese immigrants were told, if you want to leave the evacuation zone, you can go, east, and you can go to the East Coast, you could go to the Midwest, etc. But, so few people are actually able to do that. One, because it's so hard to uproot your entire life, and, some people simply didn't want to. But then, two, many people didn't actually even have the chance to, because the time period was so short. But great question.
Can I just add on to that? One of the reasons the time period was so short, and I have the exact quote in the book, but I don't remember exactly what it was, is that there were the governors of many of the states where in the middle of the country, where if the Japanese American community was going to move off the West Coast, they could have moved maybe to the East Coast, but that would have been harder. So to the middle states. There's some quote where one of the Congress people says, I surveyed the governors of all of these states, and nine out of, I think it was 12 of them, essentially said, there are no Japanese are welcome in my state unless in a concentration camp. and that was including Japanese Americans. So I think that was one reason why the government cut that short, was because it just wasn't gonna. People weren't gonna accept Japanese Americans living in their community.
But I just had one more thing to add. So even after the war ended, and technically the exclusion zone was, that was ended, and now Japanese Americans could theoretically have gone back, and many did. But, a really significant portion of the population decided not to go back west, including my family members. My grandparents ended up in New York because it was still so racist and such a hostile environment in these West Coast states. So many Japanese Americans ended up in Chicago, Midwest, on the East Coast after the war.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming. This is really fascinating. So it's unclear to me. When they were discussing the Japanese in 1942, what kind of discussion was there, or was there a discussion at the same time about German as well as Italian Americans?
I mean, is it Benditson? Well, how did that work? Did he exclude them outright, or what kind of associations they had previously?
Yeah, such a good question. I want you to help fact check me as well. But as far as I remember, the exclusion policy, was written in such a way that it did not actually specify race or ethnicity. And so the West Coast exclusion zone was just sort of labeled as that exclusion zone, in which the government had the power to sort of do things for the sake of national defense, military necessity. And so that did allow government officials to also target Italians and Germans. However, I think, and Tracy, please let me know, well, there's certainly no sort of systematic, comprehensive exclusion of those forced removal and incarceration of those populations. And it was more so, I think, immigrants who had been maybe seen as threats for whatever reason. Do you want to say more?
Yeah. So, what I can add to that is that, so yes, when the exclusion zones were set up, and when Order 9066, Executive Order 9066, which was what Roosevelt signed, it was very vague, and it basically said that we're going to give the Army the right to designate anybody that is seen as a threat as excluded from the, so who is no longer allowed in this area, basically. And it did not say Japanese American. It didn't say anybody. It didn't say German, Italian. And then the civilian exclusion orders began to be written and released by Benditson and Benditson's boss. And those said Japanese American. So at first there were curfews, and I believe, and you can fact check me on this, that it was actually, the curfews were for German immigrants, Italian immigrants, and Japanese immigrants, and native born, and citizens. And then the forced removal was announced, and that was only Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants, basically. So there, I'm sure there were, I don't know who, but I'm sure there were some Italian American or German American people who were maybe suspected of something and incarcerated, but it was done on a person-by-person basis, right? It was that there's some reason to suspect this person. They've done something other than that they happen to have ancestors who came from a country that we're now at war with.
On your German mother's side, did any of her relatives, were they Nazis? And if so, how do you reconcile the Nazi oppressor and reconcile it with your Japanese oppressed victim?
So in my family, on my mother's side, there were no Nazi soldiers, but I know that my great-grandfather, actually, of both my, so my mother's, oh gosh, let me get this right. So I had two great-grandfathers who were trained conductors, and they only ever mentioned, transporting coal and supplies. And so, of course, as somebody who's hearing train conductor, I'm like, oh my gosh, that just evokes such a terrible history related to the Holocaust, of course. But as so many German families, they never mentioned actually being directly involved in more so the extermination, the mass systematic extermination of Jewish people as well as other targeted groups. And so, I think one thing that I will mention that is really confusing for me to think about is actually my German grandfather, my mother's father. He was in the Hitler Youth growing up, just because it was kind of commonplace for all children. And I think he would have been, in his early teens before the war started. So he was also too young to fight. So, I think our family was lucky in the sense where they didn't have to fight directly. But because he was part of the Hitler Youth, somehow his name ended up on a list of Nazi leaders after the war. And so they were living in East Germany. And so when, the Soviet Union came in, they actually repurposed the Nazi camps for denazification camps. And somehow my grandfather ended up in one of those camps. So I think from the age of 15 to 18, he just was in one of those. He was in like Buchenwald and another camp that was now being used by the Soviet Union it was essentially like a forced labor, but really complex history because his time there was really terrible. But as a German person, you don't like talking about that because you don't want to at all talk about Germans as having been victimized in any way, given the atrocities that their nation committed. So I think that's a history that I grapple with as somebody who it's so much easier to talk about the incarceration of my Japanese American grandparents because everyone agrees that this is a grave injustice. But I hardly ever talk about my German grandfather's incarceration because it's really complex, having been part of this perpetrator nation. And it's really just comes down to, thinking about individuals and versus maybe like the state entities and, state officials and leaders who are, making these decisions versus somebody who's just born into a country. So I'm still grappling. Great question.
Can I just thank you for that answer and say, you got to write that book? That's fascinating.
We'll conclude here. So can we please thank our speakers so much for joining us today?